Dr. Ethan Hayes, a sound designer obsessed with perfection, believes he has found his sanctuary, the Thorne Chamber, the quietest place on Earth. His goal is to capture absolute silence, the foundational canvas for his magnum opus. But the chamber doesn't just block sound, it filters reality. In the crushing quiet, he discovers that true silence is not empty, it's a presence. An ancient, formless entity that communicates through anti-sounds, voids in reality, begins to notice him back. The silence is a predator, and it is hungry, threatening to erase not just sound, but Ethan himself. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The quiet hum of the mixing board's fan was a gnat-like annoyance, a mosquito's whine in the cathedral of sound Ethan was trying to build. He adjusted his Sennheiser HD 800s, the soft cups a familiar pressure against his temples, and hit playback. The cello solo, recorded just an hour ago, filled his ears. Rich, resinous, deeply emotional. But it was imperfect. Beneath the main melodic line, infinitesimally quiet, but undeniably there, was a faint 60-cycle hum from the studio's ancient wiring. A ghost in the machine. To anyone else, it was undetectable, a flaw swallowed by the sheer beauty of the performance. To Ethan, it was a scar across the Mona Lisa's face. "It's no good," he muttered, scrubbing the audio back and forth. The hum was a persistent, stubborn weed in his perfectly manicured garden of sound. This obsession was his gift and his curse. Dr. Ethan Hayes, at 38, was a name whispered with reverence in the niche circles of audio engineering and acoustic design. He didn't just record sound, he sculpted it, chasing a purity that bordered on the fanatical. His work on the immersive soundscapes for the critically acclaimed film Helios had won him an Oscar, but he felt like a fraud. Every sound he had ever designed, every note he had ever captured, was contaminated by the ambient noise of the world. That's why he had poured nearly a third of his life savings into securing 2 weeks in the legendary Thorne Chamber. It wasn't just an anechoic chamber, it was the anechoic chamber. Built by the eccentric and now reclusive physicist Dr. Eris Thorne, it was a place of myth. Rumors claimed it held the world record for quietness, reaching negative decibels, a level of silence so profound it was physically disorienting. Thorne had built it for his own esoteric research into cosmic background frequencies before abruptly abandoning his work and disappearing from public life, leaving the chamber in the care of a private research institute. Ethan's project was audacious, to record and analyze true, absolute silence. He believed that if he could understand the texture of nothingness, he could build soundscapes that felt more real than reality itself. The day he arrived, the facility manager, a stoic woman named Jensen, led him down a series of sterile white corridors. The final door was a foot-thick vault of steel and composite materials. "Once you're in and this door is sealed, you're on your own," Jensen said, her voice flat. "Your comms are on a dedicated line. Emergency release is the red panel to the left of the interior doorframe. Don't touch it unless the building is on fire." Ethan nodded, his heart beginning to thump with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Jensen spun the heavy wheel lock, and the door swung inward with a gasp of displaced air. The sight beyond was alien. It wasn't a room so much as a void given physical form. Every single surface, walls, ceiling, and the floor far below, was covered in 3-foot-long wedges of dark gray acoustic foam. They pointed inward like a billion stalactites, designed to trap and annihilate any sound wave that dared to enter. The only place to stand was a suspended platform of wire mesh, acoustically isolated from the main structure. He stepped inside. Jensen gave him a final, unreadable look before pulling the massive door shut. The world didn't just go quiet, it was violently extinguished. A heavy thump hiss echoed for a nanosecond as the seals engaged, and then nothing. The sudden absence of sound was a physical blow. A thick, cottony pressure clamped down on his ears, and he instinctively swallowed to try and pop them, but there was no pressure to equalize against. The silence was so absolute, it had a weight, a presence. For the first few seconds, disorientation reigned. He felt a wave of vertigo as his brain, deprived of the subtle echoes and reverberations it used to orient itself, struggled to find its balance. And then, the new sounds began, the real sounds. He could hear the soft, wet slide of his eyelids as he blinked. He could hear the faint rustle of his own hair against his collar. Louder than a drum, a thunderous, rhythmic thump, 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 thump filled the void. It was his own heartbeat. Accompanying it was a high-pitched, steady shushing sound, the blood rushing through the veins in his neck and ears. He was a universe of noise in a vacuum of silence. It was profoundly unsettling, a raw biological intimacy he had never experienced. But for Ethan, after the initial shock, it was perfect. This was the canvas he had been searching for. This was truth. He spent the next hour meticulously setting up his equipment. A matched pair of ultra-sensitive Neumann microphones, a custom-built formless preamplifier, and a solid-state recorder. Every piece of gear was chosen for its near non-existent noise floor. He draped the cables carefully, ensuring they didn't touch, their soft rubber skins a potential source of contamination. Finally, he was ready. He powered on the recorder, the tiny LED a defiant spark in the uniform darkness. He sat on the small, isolated stool he had brought in, made himself as still as a corpse, and began his first long-duration recording of absolute silence. On the recorder's small screen, the digital VU meters were flatlined. The readouts showed astonishingly low levels, just as the legends promised, negative 20.3 dBA. It was a new world record. A triumphant grin spread across his face. He had done it. He had found the purest silence in the known universe. He closed his eyes, letting the profound quiet wash over him, feeling like a pioneer on the shore of a new, undiscovered continent. He had no idea he was actually standing at the edge of an abyss, and that the abyss was already beginning to listen back. 3 days bled into a monastic routine. Ethan would spend 8-hour stretches in the chamber, recording, meditating on the stillness. The rest of his time was spent in the adjacent observation room, a small, soundproofed space where he could analyze his findings. The room was a stark contrast to the chamber's alien geometry, filled with the comforting, low hum of his analysis computer and the smell of hot electronics and brewing coffee. His partner, Maya, would call, her voice a welcome tether to the noisy, chaotic world outside. "Find your nothing yet?" she'd tease. "I found it," he'd reply, his voice buzzing with the fervor she found slightly unnerving. "It's more than I ever imagined." The inciting incident arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper on a computer screen. He was analyzing the first 24-hour recording, a long, beautiful, near-perfect capture of nothing. The waveform on his monitor was an almost completely flat line, a visual representation of the chamber's profound quiet. He ran a spectrogram analysis, a process that translated the audio data into a visual map of frequencies over time. The result should have been a blank, dark screen, with maybe a faint dusting of color at the lowest decibel levels representing the irreducible noise of his own equipment. But it wasn't blank. Down at the very bottom of the frequency spectrum, in the sub-bass region below 10 Hz, a range far beneath human hearing, the territory of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, there was a pattern. It was faint, a ghostly green line against the black, but it was undeniably there. A recurring, rhythmic pulse. It would appear for approximately 2 seconds, fade for 5, and then repeat. It was a signal, a structured piece of information in a place where none should exist. His scientific mind immediately clicked into gear. It had to be an artifact. Seismic activity? He checked the live geological survey feeds for the region. Nothing. A resonance from the building's HVAC system? Impossible. The chamber was built on a separate foundation, a floating concrete slab designed to isolate it from the very building that housed it. His own gear? He had tested every component in a Faraday cage. Their noise floor was documented, and it didn't look like this. His curiosity overriding his scientific skepticism, he isolated the anomalous frequency. He routed the signal to his headphones and began to amplify it, pushing the gain to an extreme, dangerous level. He braced himself for a low, bone-rattling hum, but there was nothing, not a sound. He cranked the amplification higher, well into the red, still silence. And then he felt it. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure, a rhythmic, pulsing pressure inside his skull, perfectly in time with the pattern on the screen. It was like having a phantom thumb gently pressing on his eardrums from the inside out. Push, release, push, release. A sound so low it bypassed the mechanics of the ear entirely and was felt only as a deep, biological throb. It was the most unnatural sensation he had ever experienced. He tore the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs. The feeling vanished. Shaken, he decided to do another session in the chamber, this time with his full attention on the phenomenon. He sealed himself inside, the heavy silence descending once more. He didn't sit. He stood perfectly still on the wire mesh, his senses on high alert, letting his body acclimate. The familiar symphony of his own biology returned, the heartbeat, the rushing blood. He closed his eyes and focused on the silence, trying to feel that subsonic pulse with his own body. 10 minutes passed, 20. Nothing but the crushing quiet. He was about to dismiss the feeling as a psychoacoustic illusion, a product of his own heightened expectation. And then, it happened. Click. The sound was sharp, distinct, and impossibly close, as if someone had snapped their fingers an inch from his right ear. He flinched violently, spinning around. But he was alone. The chamber was empty. He held his breath, listening. Silence. But the sound, it hadn't been a normal sound. A normal sound is a presence, a vibration added to the air. This had been the opposite. It felt like a small pocket of the ambient silence. The sound of his own blood, his own breathing, had been violently erased for a split second. It was a sonic hole punch, a wound in the quiet, an anti-sound. His mind reeled, trying to process the impossible sensory input. His scientific brain scrambled for an explanation. Auditory pareidolia? His brain, deprived of external stimuli, was creating phantom sounds to fill the void. It had to be. It was a known phenomenon in anechoic environments. He stumbled out of the chamber, his composure shattered, and raced to the recorder. He rewound the last few minutes of the recording and played it back. Nothing. He ran the spectrogram, and his blood ran cold. Right at the 22-minute mark, corresponding to the moment he'd heard the click, the spectrogram showed the faint, rhythmic sub-bass pulse he'd seen before. But superimposed over it was something new. A sharp, perfectly vertical black line, a void. It wasn't a spike of sound, it was a spike of no sound. A momentary, absolute cessation of all data, slicing through the noise floor of his equipment and the faint pulse of the anomaly. His recorder hadn't just captured a sound, it had captured a piece of the silence that had been erased. It was the waveform of a shadow. He stared at the screen, the rational part of his mind at war with the primal terror blooming in his chest. Equipment malfunction, a quirk of the chamber's unique construction, a hallucination. Any explanation was better than the one that was beginning to form in the deepest, most terrified corner of his soul, that he was, and had never been, alone in the silence. The following days were a descent into a specific, targeted madness. Ethan's obsession with perfection was wholly transferred from the pursuit of pure silence to the analysis of its contamination. He treated it like a scientific problem, a puzzle to be solved. But a cold knot of dread was tightening in his gut. The rational explanations were wearing thin, like threadbare cloth pulled over a monstrous shape. The anti-sounds grew more frequent and more complex. It was no longer just a simple click. During one 5-hour session, he heard a soft swoosh. the distinct impression of something large and smooth passing inches from his left ear. But again, the sensation was one of absence. For a brief, terrifying moment, the constant, low-level hiss of the blood in his own veins was carved out, scooped away in a graceful, sweeping arc. It was the acoustic shape of movement, rendered in pure, negative space. He felt the cold dread of a near miss, the instinctive flinch away from an unseen object. He was starting to feel hunted. The silence wasn't just a place, it was a territory, and he was an intruder in a predator's domain. He checked the recordings obsessively. Each time he perceived an anti-sound, the spectrogram confirmed it with a corresponding void. The shapes of these voids grew more elaborate. No longer simple lines, they were now curves, spirals, and complex, jagged shapes that defied any explanation based on signal processing errors. They looked like glyphs, like a form of writing, a language spoken by erasing sound. The phenomenon began to bleed beyond the auditory. The visual architecture of the chamber, once a sterile, geometric marvel, became a source of terror. The endless, repeating pattern of the dark foam wedges played tricks on the eyes. In the dim, indirect light he used, he began to see things. Faint, shimmering distortions in his peripheral vision, like heat haze rising from asphalt on a blistering summer day. Only the air in the chamber was cold and utterly still. At first, he dismissed it as optical fatigue. But then he noticed the correlation. A sharp, cutting anti-sound, the impression of a tearing fabric made of nothing, would manifest in his right ear, and simultaneously, he'd see a brief, violent shimmer in the foam wedges to his right. A swirling, liquid void in the air would correspond with a swooshing, hollowed-out feeling in his head. The entity, if he dared to call it that, was not just something he was hearing. He was beginning to see the effect it had on the space around him. He was perceiving it, or its shadow, through multiple senses. The silence had a shape. He was losing his grip. The isolation was amplifying his fear. During a call with Maya, he tried to keep his voice even, but she noticed the strain immediately. "Ethan, you sound far away. Are you sleeping in there?" No, I'm fine. Just deep in the work," he lied, his eyes darting around the observation room, half expecting to see a shimmer in the corner. "The data I'm getting it's just unbelievable." "Unbelievable good or unbelievable bad?" she asked, her tone shifting from playful to concerned. He couldn't answer. How could he possibly explain that he was cataloging the sounds made by a silent, invisible thing that lived in the quietest place on Earth? How could he tell her that he was beginning to see the sound of shadows? Deeply disturbed and desperate for a rational anchor, he decided he had to contact the chamber's creator. Finding Dr. Eris Thorne was a challenge in itself. The man had fallen off the face of the earth. There were no recent publications, no university affiliations, no social media presence. He was a ghost. After a full day of digital archaeology, cross-referencing old university staff directories with property records, Ethan found a possible email address, linked to a private server registered under a pseudonym. With trembling hands, he composed a new message. He kept it strictly professional, stripping out the fear and the wild speculation. He presented himself as a fellow researcher who had rented the chamber and observed anomalous readings. He attached 3 key files: the spectrogram showing the initial rhythmic subsonic pulse, a waveform capture of the first anti-sound click, clearly showing the vertical void, and a more recent, complex spectrogram displaying the swirling, glyph-like pattern of a more sophisticated sound. He described the phenomenon in dry, academic terms: ultra-low-frequency periodic signal, transient acoustic null events, correlated visual distortions. He ended the email with a simple, direct question. "Dr. Thorne, I am currently conducting research in your anechoic chamber and have encountered the attached anomalous data signatures. They do not correspond to any known equipment artifacts or environmental interference I am aware of. As the designer and original researcher, I was hoping you might have encountered these phenomena before, or that you might offer some insight into the unique properties of the chamber's construction that could be producing such readings. Thank you for your time. Dr. Ethan Hayes." He hit send, the click of his mouse feeling unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stared at the screen, a profound sense of dread washing over him. He felt like he had just sent a message in a bottle, not into a vast ocean, but into a deep, dark, and silent well, praying that the face that looked back up at him was a human one.
For 2 days, there was no reply. Ethan's anxiety festered, growing in the digital silence. He avoided the chamber, telling himself he was focusing on processing the existing data, but the truth was, he was afraid to go back in. The observation room, once his sanctuary, now felt like a flimsy outpost on the edge of a hostile frontier. He found himself turning on music, filling the air with noise, any noise, to keep the memory of that weighted silence at bay. The reply came at 3:17 a.m. on the third day. An email notification chimed on his laptop, a sound so sudden and sharp it made him jolt upright on the cot where he'd been fitfully sleeping. The sender was the anonymous address he'd written to. The subject line was blank. His heart pounded as he clicked it open. The message was brutally short, devoid of any greeting or formality. It was 5 lines of raw, unadulterated terror. You have made a terrible mistake. You've listened too long. The silence was never empty. It was waiting. My calculations were wrong. The filter is too perfect. Get out. Destroy the recordings. Stop listening. Now. The words hit Ethan like a physical force. This wasn't the response of a scientist discussing an anomaly. It was a scream of warning from a man who had seen a ghost. The cryptic phrases detonated in his mind. The filter is too perfect. The silence was never empty. Thorne's panic shattered the last of Ethan's rationalizations. A new, terrifying theory crashed into place, formed from the vague dread that had been coalescing in his subconscious. The anechoic chamber wasn't a box designed to create silence. It was a filter, an incredibly precise, powerful filter. It didn't block sound from the outside world. It stripped it away, layer by layer. The air currents, the seismic vibrations, the radio waves, the chaotic, messy noise of our reality. And in doing so, it didn't leave behind a vacuum. It revealed what was always there, underneath. The subsonic entity. It wasn't from somewhere else. It was here. It was everywhere, a fundamental frequency or level of reality that was constantly, mercifully masked by the noise of existence. The Thorne Chamber was the only place on Earth quiet enough for a human to perceive it. The entity wasn't invading the silence. The silence was the entity. And he, Ethan Hayes, had spent weeks pointing the most sensitive microphones in the world directly at it, giving it his undivided attention. He hadn't just been observing, he had been communing. A wave of nausea and vertigo swept over him. He grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen, and dialed Maya. He needed to hear her voice, a real voice, a connection to the world of noise he had so arrogantly abandoned. "Ethan," she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "It's 3 a.m. Is everything okay?" "No, nothing is okay," he stammered, his voice cracking. He was pacing the small room, his gaze darting towards the sealed vault door of the chamber. "Maya, you have to listen to me. I got an email from Thorne, the guy who built this place. He told me to get out, to destroy everything." "What? Why? What's going on?" He tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a panicked, incoherent stream. "The silence, it's not empty. It's a thing, Maya, a frequency. Thorne didn't build a quiet room, he built a filter, and he found something, and he ran, and I've been listening to it for weeks." "Ethan, slow down," Maya said, her voice now sharp with concern. "You're not making any sense. You sound strange." "What do you mean, strange?" There was a pause on the line. He could hear the faint sound of her sitting up in bed, the rustle of sheets. "Your voice," she said slowly, and he could feel the goosebumps rising on her own skin through the phone. "It sounds thin. All the bass is gone. It's like it's hollowed out. There's no resonance." Ethan stopped pacing, his blood turning to ice. "And there's this other sound," Maya continued, her voice dropping to a frightened whisper. "Around your words, on the line. It's like little clicks, little empty spaces. What is that noise, Ethan? What's that clicking?" He held the phone away from his face, staring at it in horror. He couldn't hear the clicks she was describing. He couldn't hear the thinness in his own voice. The silence, the entity, had already begun its work on him. It was filtering him. It was leaking out of the chamber, using him as a conduit, its unnatural quiet bleeding through the phone line into the noisy, safe world he had left behind. He wasn't just a listener anymore. He was becoming a broadcaster.
Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. Ethan threw on his jacket, grabbed his laptop bag, and fled the observation room without a second thought for the multi-million-dollar recording setup still sitting inside the chamber. He didn't just walk out of the facility, he ran, bursting through the main doors into the pre-dawn gloom, the damp, cool air a shocking balm on his skin. The distant rumble of an early morning truck on the highway was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was real. It was beautifully, blessedly noisy. He drove the 2 hours back to his apartment in the city, the car stereo blasting a chaotic mix of talk radio and classic rock, a desperate attempt to build a sonic wall around himself. He vowed never to go back. He would email the Institute, tell them he had a family emergency. He would abandon the project, abandon the recordings, he would forget the chamber, Thorne's warning, and the terrifying thinness Maya had heard in his voice. But leaving the chamber was not enough. The phenomenon followed him. The first sign came that afternoon. He was standing in his kitchen, the comforting hum of the refrigerator filling the space. It was a sound he knew intimately, the specific drone of that particular compressor. And for a full 2 seconds, it hollowed out. The pitch and rhythm remained, but the core of the sound vanished, replaced by that same sickeningly familiar pocket of unnatural silence he had experienced in the chamber. The hum became a ghost of itself, an outline of a sound. He stumbled back, clutching the counter for support. The anti-sounds were in his home. It was the beginning of a full-scale sensory deconstruction. His world, once a rich tapestry of sound, began to unravel thread by thread. He put on a favorite orchestral piece by Debussy, seeking comfort in its complexity. Halfway through, the sweeping string section simply dropped out. Not as if the recording had failed, but as if the very concept of strings had been momentarily erased from reality, leaving only the flutes and the brass hanging in a sparse, mutilated soundscape. He listened to a podcast, and the host's voice would suddenly lose its consonant sounds, becoming a stream of thin, ethereal vowels. The silence was eating the complexity of the sounds around him, digesting them, leaving behind simplified, emaciated versions. A new form of tinnitus set in. It wasn't the high-pitched ringing many people experience. It was a constant, low-level feeling of pressure in his ears, the same pressure he'd felt when first amplifying the entity's subsonic pulse. The world felt perpetually off balance, slightly unreal, like a film that had been dubbed with a cheap, poorly mixed audio track. The richness of reality was being leached away, and he was the focal point of the decay. His own body became a source of horror. The satisfying thud of his feet on the hardwood floor would occasionally become a soft, weightless puff. The sound of his own chewing became a series of hollow clicks and wet, substanceless slides. He was being de-rezzed, his own physical interactions with the world losing their sonic integrity. The entity wasn't just following him, it was inside him, nested in his auditory cortex, rewriting his perception of the world from the inside out. He had listened to the silence for so long that he had learned its language, and now he couldn't stop hearing it everywhere. The filter he had sought in the chamber was now permanently installed in his own mind. The epicenter of the decay, he soon realized, was his laptop bag. He had brought the recordings with him. The hard drives containing the silence sat on his desk, and they emanated a palpable aura of cold and dread. The air around them seemed different, heavier. When he forced himself to get close, the feeling of pressure in his ears intensified. The hollowing out effect on the ambient sounds in his apartment grew more frequent and more pronounced the closer he was to the drives. He hadn't just recorded a sound, he had trapped a piece of the entity itself, like a specimen in a jar, and had carelessly brought it out of its sterile enclosure and into the wider world. He tried to destroy them. He took one of the backup drives to the apartment's incinerator chute, his hand trembling as he held it over the opening. But he couldn't let it go. A horrifying thought paralyzed him. What if destroying the drive didn't destroy the entity, but released it? What if the data wasn't a recording, but a cage? The recordings were the only concrete evidence he had. They were the key to understanding what was happening to him, and perhaps the only way to fight it. Desperate, he knew he had to talk to Thorne again. A simple email wouldn't suffice. He needed answers. He spent hours trying to trace the physicist's digital footprint from the email header, a process made difficult by his own fracturing concentration. Finally, he found a vulnerability in Thorne's private server, a backdoor that led him not to a location, but to an encrypted video conferencing ID. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. He initiated the call. For a moment, there was only static. Then, the connection stabilized. The face that appeared on his screen was a ruin. Dr. Eris Thorne looked like a haunted old man, his eyes wide and sunken in a face pale and wrinkled with chronic fear. He was sitting in a cluttered room, strange-looking acoustic paneling visible behind him. "You," Thorne rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You didn't listen." "I got out. I destroyed nothing," Ethan said, his voice thin and reedy even to his own ears now. "It followed me. The recordings. I think it's in the recordings. Tell me what it is. Tell me." Thorne looked away from the camera, a shudder running through his frail body. He looked like a man confessing a mortal sin. "I was arrogant," he began, his voice barely audible. "My field was cosmic background radiation. I was searching for a sound, the sound of creation, a theoretical cosmic background frequency left over from the Big Bang, the symphony of existence." He gestured weakly at the room around him. "The chamber was my instrument, a filter designed to strip away every other noise in the universe until only that one pure note remained." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I found its opposite. I found the base note of the universe's eventual heat death, a frequency of decay, a sentient, parasitic silence. It is the acoustic entropy of the universe, given a primal, malevolent consciousness." Ethan stared, the cosmic scale of the horror making him feel small and insignificant. "It's a parasite," Thorne continued, his eyes locking on Ethan's, filled with a terrible pity. "It's drawn to complexity, to information, to sound waves that carry meaning and structure. It feeds on them by unmaking them, by reducing them to their simplest, quietest state. My research wasn't a failure, it was a catastrophe. I didn't discover the sound of creation. I built a perfect amplifier for the voice of universal decay." "What does it want?" Ethan pleaded, the pressure in his ears building to an almost unbearable level. Thorne's expression grew even darker. "It wants what any parasite wants, to spread. It was trapped in the chamber, perceptible but contained. But you are a master of sound. You have a deep intuitive understanding of frequency and resonance. You didn't just listen to it, you resonated with it. Now it's using you. It will use your recordings, your knowledge, your mind itself as a template to create a resonance cascade." A resonance cascade? A way to amplify itself, to broadcast its frequency out into the world, to silence more than just your apartment, to silence everything. You are no longer the listener, Dr. Hayes. You have become the instrument. Thorne's words echoed in the oppressive quiet of Ethan's apartment. He was an instrument, a speaker for the apocalypse of sound. The realization didn't just terrify him, it galvanized him. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. The entity was tied to him and his recordings. To fight it, he had to go back to the source, back to the chamber. He called Thorne again. "There has to be a way to fight it," he said, his new, thin voice filled with a desperate resolve. On the screen, Thorne looked surprised by Ethan's fire. "Fighting silence with more silence is impossible," he warned. "I'm not going to fight it with silence," Ethan countered, an idea taking shape in his mind, born from Thorne's own words. "You said it feeds on complex, meaningful sound. You said its nature is pure, ordered silence, the frequency of decay. What's its antithesis? What is the opposite of a single, pure, entropic frequency?" Thorne was silent for a moment, his old, brilliant mind reigniting. "Not just noise," he whispered, his eyes widening. "Noise can be chaotic but simple. Its true opposite would be a cacophony, a dense, multi-layered, chaotic, but infinitely meaningful sound, a wall of pure, complex, living information." That was it. The plan was insane, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. He spent the next 12 hours in a frenzy of creation. He didn't sleep, he barely ate. He gathered every sound he had ever cherished. He downloaded audio from historical archives, from nature documentaries, from linguistic studies. On his timeline, he layered it all, weaving a dense, intricate tapestry of pure existence. It was a sonic monument to life. The first cries of newborn babies, the impassioned speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. and Winston Churchill, the sound of a humpback whale song overlapping with the frantic buzzing of a beehive, a full orchestra playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony while thousands of sports fans roared in a stadium, a child's laughter interwoven with the sound of rain on a tin roof, lovers whispering in a dozen different languages, the roar of a rocket launch, the chatter of a busy marketplace, the chirping of birds at dawn. He compressed none of it, equalized none of it. He let the frequencies clash and fight, a vibrant, chaotic war of information. He called the file cacophony.wav and loaded it, along with 4 powerful tour-grade speakers, into his car. Returning to the chamber was a surreal nightmare. The facility was dark and empty. He used his old access card, the electronic beep sounding impossibly loud. As he approached the vault door, the pressure in his ears became a throbbing pain. The silence was calling to him, eager for his return. He dragged the heavy speakers inside one by one, placing them on the wire mesh floor, pointing inward to create a vortex of sound. The presence was overwhelming now, a physical weight in the air. He could feel his own thoughts beginning to thin out, the complex sentences in his mind simplifying into single, stark words. Cold, dark, end. The entity was trying to silence his very consciousness. He was losing time. His movements became sluggish, his vision starting to shimmer violently at the edges. With the last of his strength, he plugged the output from his laptop into the speaker's amplifier and navigated to the audio file. His finger hovered over the trackpad. He hit play. For a split second, there was nothing. Then the speakers erupted. The chamber, built for absolute silence, was violated by an explosion of pure, unadulterated life. A billion clashing sounds hammered the sound-absorbing wedges. The entity, the pure, ordered silence, reacted with unimaginable violence. The anti-sounds became deafening voids, entire sections of the cacophony being violently erased for milliseconds at a time, creating a sickening stuttering effect. The air pressure fluctuated wildly, making his ears pop and my lungs ache. It felt like the room was breathing in and out, the silence fighting to reclaim its territory. The visual distortions became blinding, the dark wedges seeming to twist and writhe as if in agony. It was a battle between 2 absolute concepts, the pure frequency of nullity against the infinite, chaotic frequencies of existence. Ethan fell to his knees on the wire mesh, clutching his head, caught in the crossfire.
He could feel the entity focusing on him, trying to use him to find a weakness in the noise to silence the source. But the sound was too much, too complex, too full of life, of history, of emotion, of meaning. It was a sonic tsunami that the entity, for all its power, could not filter. It could not find a pattern to deconstruct. It was pure, beautiful, glorious chaos.
The climax was not an explosion, but a shattering. A high-pitched whine, like feedback from a dying amplifier, echoed through the chamber. The oppressive, weighted silence, the very fabric of the entity's presence, broke apart. For the first time since he'd entered the chamber, Ethan heard an echo. The cacophony from the speakers bounced off the walls, a messy, glorious reverberation that the foam wedges could no longer fully contain. The acoustic space had been retuned. The pure, living noise had overloaded the filter, forcing reality, in all its noisy imperfection, back into the void. The presence, the cold, hungry intelligence was gone, washed away, or perhaps just forced back into a deep dormancy, drowned by the flood of life. Ethan stumbled out of the chamber, his ears ringing from the sheer volume, a triumphant, painful ringing that was the most wonderful sound in the world. He collapsed in the hallway, gasping for air that felt clean and light. The mundane buzz of the corridor's fluorescent lights, a sound he would have meticulously filtered out weeks ago, now sounded like the most beautiful symphony he had ever heard. Every tiny, insignificant noise, the distant hum of the building's ventilation, the creak of his own leather jacket, the sound of his own ragged breathing, was a confirmation. He was alive, and the world was still gloriously, beautifully loud. He didn't destroy the chamber. That would be an act of fear. Instead, he and a now believing, cautiously hopeful Dr. Thorne repurposed it. They set up a permanent, low-level broadcast system inside. It didn't play the chaotic cacophony cure constantly. That was too brutal. Instead, they created a looping, 24-hour audio file of gentle, complex, natural sounds. A soft rainfall, a babbling brook, the rustling of leaves in a forest, the distant sounds of a city at dawn. It was a constant guard of living sound, a gentle, sonic fence to keep the silence at bay. Ethan's work was no longer about purity, it was about preservation. He had stumbled upon a new, terrifying field of science, the acoustic ecology of reality. Months later, Ethan was a different man. He had moved out of his quiet apartment into a smaller place overlooking a busy downtown street. He found solace in traffic, in the constant, overlapping chatter of human life. He never sought silence. He took walks without headphones, immersing himself in the ambient noise of the world. The final scene finds him in a crowded city square on a bright, sunny afternoon. The air is thick with the sounds of life, cars honking, vendors shouting, music bleeding from a nearby cafe, children laughing as they chase pigeons. He buys a hot dog from a street cart, the sizzle on the grill a sound he savors. He finds an empty bench and sits, taking it all in. For a moment, he closes his eyes, not to shut the world out, but to let it all in. He focuses his trained ears, listening past the immediate chaos, past the traffic, past the chatter, past the music. He pushes his perception deeper, to the very foundation of the noise, to the quiet hum of the city's electrical grid that lay beneath it all. And deep, deep underneath it, so faint it's almost imaginary, a feeling more than a sound, he can still feel it. Thump, release, thump, release. A tiny, rhythmic pulse of absolute, perfect, and hungry silence. It was still there, waiting. And Ethan smiled, a genuine, fearless smile. Because he knew the noise was winning. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.